The Psychology of the Unconscious, a study of the transformations and symbolisms of the libido by Jung, Chapter 3. The Hymn of Creation. The second chapter in Miss Miller's work is entitled Glory à Dieu, Poème Onirique. When 20 years of age, Miss Miller took a long journey through Europe. We leave the description of it to her. After a long and rough journey from New York to Stockholm, from there to Petersburg and Odessa, I found it a true pleasure to leave the world of inhabited cities. A footnote on pleasure. The choice of words and comparisons is always significant. A psychology of travels and the unconscious forces cooperating with them is yet to be written. So I found it a true pleasure to leave the world of inhabited cities and to enter the world of waves, sky, and silence. I stayed long hours on deck to dream, stretched out in a reclining chair. The histories, legends, and myths of the different countries which I saw in the distance came back to me indistinctly blended together in a sort of luminous mist, in which things lost the reality, while the dreams and thoughts alone took on somewhat the appearance of reality. At first I even avoided all company and kept to myself, lost wholly in my dreams, where all that I knew of great, beautiful, and good came back into my consciousness with new strength and new life. I also employed a great part of my time writing to my distant friends, reading and sketching out short poems about the regions visited. Some of these poems were of a very serious character. It may seem superfluous, perhaps, to enter intimately into all these details. If we recall, however, the remark made above, that when people let their unconscious speak, they always tell us the most important thing of their intimate selves, then even the smallest detail appears to have meaning. Valuable personalities invariably tell us, through their unconscious, things that are generally valuable, so that patient interest is rewarded. Miss Miller describes her state of introversion after the life of the cities, where, with the cities with their many impressions, had been absorbing her interest, with which already discussed strength of suggestion, which powerfully enforced that impression. She breathed freely upon the ocean, and after so many external impressions became engrossed wholly in the internal with intentional abstraction from the surroundings, so that things lost their reality, and dreams became truth. We know from psychopathology that certain mental disturbances exist which are first manifested by the individuals shutting themselves off slowly, more and more from reality, and sinking into their fantasies, during which process, in proportion as reality loses its hold, the inner world gains in reality and determining power. So, footnote on disturbances. This mental disturbance had until recently the very unfortunate designation dementia praecox given by K. Lim. It is extremely unfortunate that this malady should have been discovered by the psychiatrists, for its apparently bad prognosis is due to this circumstance. Dementia praecox is synonymous with therapeutic hopelessness. How would hysteria appear if judged from the standpoint of psychiatry? The psychiatrist naturally sees in the institutions only the worst case of dementia praecox, and as a consequence of her therapeutic helplessness, she must be a pessimist. How deplorable would tuberculosis appear if the physician of one asylum for the incurable described the nosology of the disease? Just as little as the chronic case of hysteria, which gradually degenerated in insane asylums, are characterized of real hysteria, just a little are the cases of dementia praecox in asylums characteristic of those early forms so frequent in general practice, and which Janet has described under the name of physasthenia, physachanthenia. These cases fall under Buhler's description of schizophrenia, a name which connotes a psychological fact, and might easily be compared with similar facts in hysteria. The term which I use in my private work for these conditions is introversion neurosis, by which, in my opinion, the most important characteristic of the condition is given, namely, the predominance of introversion over transference, which later is a characteristic feature of hysteria. In my psychology of dementia praecox, I have not made any study of the relationship of the psychasthenia of Genet. Subsequent experience with dementia praecox, particularly the study of psychasthenia in Paris, have demonstrated to me that the essential relationship of Genet's group with the introversion neuroses, the schizophrenia of Bleuner. And footnote to the last part of the sentence, comparing the similar views in my article, the articles listed, this author, in support of Freud, defines the chief characteristic of dementia praecox as autoeroticism, which I have asserted is only one of the results of introversion. Back to the reading. This process leads to a certain point, which varies with the individual, when the patient suddenly become more or less conscious of this separation from reality. The event which then enters is the pathological excitation, that is to say, the patient begins to turn towards the environment with diseased views, to be sure, which, however, still represent the compensating, although unsuccessful attempts at transference. Footnote. Freud, to whom I am indebted for an essential part of his view, also speaks of Heilwirkung, the attempt toward cure, the search towards health. End footnote. The methods of reaction are naturally very different. I would not concern myself more closely about this here. This type appears to be generally a psychological rule, which holds for all neuroses and, therefore, also for the normal in a much lesser degree. We might, therefore, expect that Miss Miller, after this energetic and persevering introversion, which had even encroached for a time upon the feeling of reality, would succumb anew to an impression of the real world, and also just as suggestive and energetic an influence as that of her dreams. Let us proceed with the narrative. Quote, but as the journey drew to an end, the ship's officers outdid themselves in kindness. Tout ce qu'il y a de plus empressé et de plus aimable. And I passed many amusing hours teaching them English. On the Sicilian coast, in the harbor of Catalina, I wrote a sailor's song which was very similar to a song well known on the sea, Brine, Wine, and Damsels Fine. The Italians in general all sing very well, and one of the officers who sang on deck during the night watch had made a great impression upon me and had given me the idea of writing some words adapted to his melody. Soon after that I was very nearly obliged to reverse the well-known saying, "Veder Napoli e poi morir," that is to say, suddenly I became very ill, although not dangerously so. I recovered to such an extent, however, that I could go on land to visit the sights of the city in a carriage. This day tired me very much, and since we had planned to see Pisa the following day, I went on board early in the evening and soon lay down to sleep without thinking of anything more serious than the beauty of the officers and the ugliness of the Italian beggars. One is somewhat disappointed at meeting here, instead of the expected impression of reality, a rather small intermezzo of flirtation. Nevertheless, one of the officers, the singer, had made a great impression. Il m'avait fait beaucoup d'impression. The remark at the close of the description, sans songer à rien de plus sérieux que la beauté des officiers, and so on, diminishes the seriousness of the impression. It is true. The assumption, however, that the impression openly influenced the mood very much is supported by the fact that a poem upon a subject of such an erotic character came forth immediately. Brine, Wine, and Damsels Fine, and in the singer's honor. One is only too easily inclined to take such an impression lightly, and one admits so gladly the statements of the participants when they represent everything as simple and not as at all serious. I dwell upon this impression at length, because it is important to know that an erotic impression after such an introversion has a deep effect and is undervalued possibly by Miss Miller. The suddenly passing sickness is obscure and needs a psychologic interpretation, which cannot be touched upon here because of lack of data. The phenomena now to be described can only be explained as arising from a disturbance which reached to the very depths of her being. From Naples to Livorno, the ship traveled for a night, during which I slept more or less well. My sleep, however, is seldom deep or dreamless. It seems to me as if my mother's voice wakened me just at the end of the following dream. At first I had a vague conception of the words, "When the morning stars sang together," which were the preludium of a certain confused representation of creation and of mighty chorals resounding through the universe. In spite of the strange, contradictory, and confused character which is peculiar to the dream, there was mingled in it the chorus of an oratio, which had been given by one of the foremost musical societies of New York, and with which were also memories of Milton's Paradise Lost. Then from out of this world there seemed slowly emerge certain words, which arranged themselves into three strophes, and indeed they seemed to be in my own handwriting, on ordinary blue-lined writing paper on a page of my old poetry book, which I always carried around with me. In short, they appeared to me exactly as some minutes later they were in reality in my book. Miss Miller wrote down the following poem, which she rearranged somewhat a few months later to make it more nearly, in her opinion, like the dream original. When the eternal first met sound, a myriad ears sprang out to hear, and throughout all the universe there rolled an echo deep and clear. All glory to the God of sound. When the Eternal first made light, a myriad eyes sprang out to look, and hearing ears and seeing eyes once more a mighty choral took. All glory to the God of light. When the Eternal first gave love, a myriad hearts sprang into life, ears filled with music, eyes with light, pealed forth with hearts, with love all rife. All glory to the God of love. Before we enter upon Miss Miller's attempts to bring to light through her suppositions the root of this subliminal creation, we will attempt a short analytic survey of the material already in our possession. Footnote to Miss Miller's suppositions. Miss Miller's publication gives no hint of any knowledge of psychoanalysis. The impression on the ship had already been properly emphasized, so we need have no further difficulty in gaining possession of the dynamic process which brought about the poetic revelation. It was made clear in the preceding paragraphs that Miss Miller's possibility had not inconsiderably undervalued the importance of the erotic impression. This assumption gains in probability through experience, which shows that, very generally, relatively weak erotic impressions are generally undervalued. One can see this best in cases where those concerned, either from social or moral grounds, consider an erotic relationship as something quite impossible. For example, parents and children, brothers and sisters, relations between older and younger people of the same sex when it's not allowed, and so on. If the impression is relatively slight, then it does not exist at all for the participators. If the impression is strong, then tragic dependence arises, which may result in some great nonsense or be carried to any extent. This lack of understanding can go unbelievably far. Mothers who see the first erections of a small son in their own bed, a sister who half playfully embraces her brother, a 20-year-old daughter who will seat herself on her father's lap, and then has a strange sensation in her abdomen. They are all morally indignant of the highest degree, if one speaks of sexuality. Finally, our whole education is carried out with a tacit agreement to know as little as possible of the erotic, and to spread abroad the deepest ignorance in regard to it. It is no wonder, therefore, that the judgment, in puncto, of the importance of an erotic impression is generally unsafe and inadequate. Miss Miller was under the influence of a deep erotic impression, as we have seen. Because of the sum total of the feelings aroused by this, it does not seem that this impression was more than dimly realized, for the dream had to contain a powerful repetition. From analytic experience one knows that the early dreams which patients bring for analysis are none the less of a special interest, because of the fact that they bring out criticisms and valuations of the physician's personality, which previously would have been asked for directly in vain. They enrich the conscious impression which the patient had of her physician. often concerning very important points. They are naturally erotic observations which the unconscious was forced to make just because of the quite universal undervaluation and uncertain judgment of the relatively weak erotic impression. In the drastic and hyperbolic matter of expression of the dream, the impression often appears in almost unintelligible form on account of the immeasurable dimensions of the symbol. A further peculiarity which seems to rest upon the historic strata of the unconscious is this, that an erotic impression to which conscious acknowledgment is denied usurps an earlier and discarded transference and expresses itself in that. Therefore, it frequently happens, for example, that among young girls at the time of their first love, remarkable difficulties develop in the capacity for erotic expression, which may be reduced analytically to disturbances through a regressive attempt at resurrection of the father image, or the Father Imago. Footnote. Here I purposely give preference to the term imago rather than to the expression complex, in order by choice of terminology to invest the psychological condition which I include under imago, with living independence in the psychical history, that is to say, with the autonomy which, from a large experience, I have claimed as an essential peculiarity of the emotional complex. Compare the psychology of the dementia praecox. My critics, Iserlin explains, have seen in this view a return to medieval psychology, and they have therefore rejected it utterly. This return took place on my part consciously and intentionally, because the fantastic projected psychology of ancient and modern superstitions, especially demonology, furnishes exhaustive evidence for this point of view. Particularly interesting insights and confirmations is given to us by the insane Schreiber in an autobiography, where he has given complete expression to the doctrine of autonomy. Imago has a significance similar, on the one hand, to the psychology conceived creation in Spittler's novel Imago, and on the other hand, to the ancient religious conception of images elares. Indeed, that's end of footnote. Indeed, one may presume something similar in Miss Miller's case, for the idea of the masculine creative deity is a derivation, analytically and historically psychologic, of the Father Imago. It aims above all to replace the discarded infantile father transference in such a way that for the individual the passing from the narrow circle of the family into the wider circle of human society may be simpler or made easier. In light of this reflection, we can see in the poem and its preludium the religious, poetically formed product of an introversion depending upon the surrogate of a Father Imago. In spite of the incomplete apperception of the effectual impression, essential component parts of this are included in the idea of compensation as mark, so to speak, of its origin. Weiser had coined for this the striking expression, law of the return of the complex. The effectual impression was that of the officer singing in the night watch, when the morning stars sang together. The idea of this opened a new world to the girl, creation. The Creator has created tone, then light, then love. That the first to be created should have been tone can be made clear only individually, for there is no cosmology except for the gnosis of Hermes, a generally quite unknown system, which would have had such tendencies. But now we might venture a conjecture that is already apparent, which will soon be proved through the following chain of associations: the singer, the singing morning stars, God of tone, the Creator, God of light, and of sun, and of fire, and of love. The links of this chain are proven by the material, and with the exception of sun and fire, which I put in parentheses, but which, however, will be proven through what follows in further course of the analysis. All of these expressions, with one exception, belong to erotic speech. My God, star, light, my sun, fire of love, fiery love, etc. Creator appears quite distinct at first, and becomes understandable through the reference to the undertone of eros, to the vibrating chord of nature which attempts to renew itself in every pair of lovers, and awaits the wonder of creation. Miss Miller had taken pains to disclose the unconscious creation of her mind to her understanding, and indeed, through a procedure which agrees in principle with psychoanalysis, and therefore leads to the same results as psychoanalysis. But, as usually happens with laymen and beginners, Miss Miller, because she has no knowledge of psychoanalysis, left off at the thoughts which necessarily bring the deep complex lying at the bottom of it to light, in an indirect, that is to say, censored manner. More than this, a simple method, merely the carrying out of the thought to its conclusion, is sufficient to discover the meaning. Miss Miller finds it astonishing that her unconscious fantasy does not, following the Mosaic account of the creation, put light in the first place instead of tone. Now follows an explanation, theoretically constructed and corrected ad hoc, the hollowness of which is, however, characteristic of all similar attempts at explanations. She says, "It is perhaps interesting to recall that Anaxagoras also had the cosmos arise out of chaos, though a sort of whirlwind, which does not happen usually without producing a sound." Footnote. As is well known, Anaxagoras developed the conception of the living primal power, Eurypontes, of Voi's mind, imparts movement, as if by a blast of wind, to the dead primal power, Eurypotes, of manner. There is naturally no mention of sound. Thus Voi's, or mind, which is very similar to the latter conception of Philo, the Logos supermatigos of the Gnostics, and the Pauline pneuma, spirit, as well as the pneuma of the contemporary Christian theologians, has rather the old mythological significance of fructifying breath of the winds, which impregnated the mirrors of Louisiana and the Egyptian vultures. The animation of Adam and the impregnation of the Mother of God by the pneuma are produced in a similar manner. The infantile incest of pheasantry of one of my patients reads, "The father covered her face with his hands and blew into her open mouth." End of footnote. So, continuing with Miss Miller. But at this time I had studied Noah's philosophy, and I knew nothing about either Anaxagoras or his theories about the Nous, which I unconsciously was openly following. At that time, also, I was equally in complete ignorance of Leibniz, and therefore I knew nothing of the doctrine of Dum Deus calcut fit mundus. Miss Miller's references to Anaxagoras and to Leibniz both refer to creation by means of thought, that is to say, that divine thought alone could bring forth a new material reality, a reference at first not intelligible, but which will soon, however, be more easily understood. We now come to those fancies from which Miss Miller principally drew on her unconscious creation. In the first place, there is the Paradise Lost by Milton, which we had at home in the edition illustrated by Doré, which had often delighted me from childhood. Then the Book of Job, which had been read aloud to me since the time of my earliest recollection. Moreover, if one compares the first words of Paradise Lost with my first verse, one notices that there is the same verse measure of man's first disobedience, when the Eternal first made a sound. My poem also recalls various pages in Job, and one or two places in Handel's Horatio, the creation, which came out very indistinctly in the first part of the dreams. Footnote. Handel's creation may be meant. End footnote. The Paradise Lost, which, as is well known, is so closely connected with the beginning of the world, is made more clearly evident by the verse of man's first disobedience, which is concerned evidently with the fall, the meaning of which need not be shown any further. I know the objection which every one unacquainted with psychoanalysis will arise, that Miss Miller might just as well have chosen any other verse as an example, and that accidentally she had taken the first one that happened to appear, which had this content, almost also accidentally. It is well known the criticisms which we hear equally from our medical colleagues and from our patients is generally based on such arguments. This misunderstanding arises from the fact that the law of causation in the psychical sphere is not taken seriously enough. That is to say, there are no accidents, no just as wells. It is so, and there is, therefore, a sufficient reason at hand why it is so. It is moreover true that Miss Miller's poem is connected with the fall, wherein just that erotic component comes forth, the existence of which we will have surmised above. Miss Miller neglects to tell which passage in Job occurred to her mind. These, unfortunately, are therefore only general suppositions. Take first the analogy of the lost paradise. Job lost all that he had, and this was due to an act of Satan, who wished to incite him against God. In the same way mankind, through the temptation of the serpent, lost paradise and was plunged into earth's torments. The idea, or rather the mood, which is expressed in the reference to the lost paradise is Miss Miller's feeling that she had lost something which was connected with satanic temptation. To her it happened just as to Job, that she suffered innocently, for she did not fall victim to temptation. Job's sufferings are not understood by his friends. No one knows that Satan had taken a hand in the game, and that Job was truly innocent. Job never tries to avow his innocence. Is there a hint in that? We know that certain neurotic and especially mentally diseased people continually defend their innocence against non-existent attacks. However, one discovers at a closer examination that the patient, while he appropriately defends his innocence without reason, fulfills with that a Deckhandlung, the energy for which arises just just those impulses whose sinful character is revealed by the contents of the pretend reproach and calamity. Footnote. I recall the case of a young insane girl who continually imagined that her innocence was suspected, from which thought would not allow herself to be dissuaded. Gradually there developed out of her defenseless attitude a correspondingly energetic, positive erotomania. End footnote. Job suffered doubly. Job suffered doubly, on one side through the loss of his fortune, and on the other through the lack of understanding in his friends. The latter can be seen throughout the book. The suffering of the misunderstood recalls the figure of Cyrano de Bergerac. He too suffered doubly, on the one side through hopeless love, and on the other side through misunderstanding. He falls, as we have seen, in the last hopeless battle against le mensonge, les compromis, les préjugés, la lâcheté et la sottise. Oui, vous m'arrachez toute la laureur et la rose. Job laments, God delivereth me to the ungodly, and casteth me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, he brake me asunder. Yea, he hath taken me by the neck, and dashed me to pieces. He hath also set me up for his mark. His archers compass me round about. He cleaveth my reins asunder, and doth not spare. He poureth out my gall upon the ground. He breaketh me with branch upon branch. He runneth upon me like a giant. Job 16:11-15. The analogy of feelings lies in the suffering of the hopeless struggle against the more powerful. It is as if this conflict were accompanied from afar by the sounds of creation, which brings up a beautiful and mysterious image belonging to the unconscious, and which has not forced its way up to the light of the upper world. We surmise rather than know that this battle has really something to do with creation, with the struggles between negations and affirmations. The reference to Rostand's Cyrano, though the identification with Christian, to Milton's Paradise Lost, to the sorrows of Job, misunderstood by his friends, portray plainly that in the soul of the poet something was identified with these ideas. She also has suffered like Cyrano and Job, has lost paradise, and dreams of creation, creation by means of thought, fruition through the whirlwind of Anaxagoras. We once more submit ourselves to Miss Miller's guidance. I remember that when 15 years old, I was once very much stirred over an article, read aloud to me by my mother, concerning the idea which spontaneously produced its object. It was so excited. I was so excited that I could not sleep all night because of thinking over and over again what that could mean. From the age of 9 to 16, I went every Sunday to a Presbyterian church, in charge of which at that time was a very cultured minister. In one of the earliest members which I have retained of him, I see myself as a very small girl sitting in a very large pew, continually endeavoring to keep myself awake and pay attention, without in the least being able to understand what he meant when he spoke to us of chaos, cosmos, and the gift of love, don d'amour. There are also rather early memories of the awakening of puberty, 9 to 16, which have connected the idea of the cosmos springing from chaos with the don d'amour. The medium in which these associations occur is the memory of a certain very much honored ecclesiastic who spoke those dark words. From the same period of time comes the remembrance of that excitement about the idea of the creative thought, which from itself produces its object. Here are two ways of creation intimated: the creative thought and the mysterious reference to the don d'amour. At the time when I had not yet understood the nature of psychoanalysis, I had a fortunate opportunity of winning through continual observation a deep insight into the soul of a 15-year-old girl. Then I discovered with astonishment that the contents of the unconscious fantasies are, what the contents of the unconscious fantasies are, and how far removed they are from those which a girl of that age should shows outwardly. There are wide-reaching fantasies of truly mythical fruitfulness. The girl was, in the split-off fantasy, the race-mother of the uncounted peoples. Footnote: the case is published in Jung Psychology und Pathologie zur Natur occulte Phänomene, Munz, Leipzig, 1902. So, continuing back. If we deduct the poetically spoken fantasy of the girl, elements are left which that age are common to all girls, for the unconscious content is to an infinitely greater degree common to all people-kind than the content of the individual consciousness. For it is the condensation of that which is historically the average and ordinary. Miss Miller's problem at this age was the common human problem: how am I to be creative? Nature knows that no one answer that knows but one no one Nature knows but one answer to that: through the child, don d'amour. But how is the child attained? Here the terrifying problem emerges, which, as our analytic experience shows us, is connected with the father, where it cannot be solved, because the original sin of incest weighs heavily for all time upon the human race. The strong and natural love which binds the child to the father turns away in those years during which the humanity of the father would be all too plainly recognized, to the higher form of the father, to the fathers of the church and the Father God, visibly represented by them, and in that there lies still less possibility of solving the problem. However, mythology is not lacking in consolations. Has not Logos become flesh too? Has not the divine pneuma, even the Logos, entered the Virgin's womb and lived among us as the sons of man? The whirlwind of Anaxagoras was precisely the divine nous which, out of itself, became the world. Why do we cherish the image of the Virgin Mother even to this day? Because it is always comforting, and says without speech or noisy sermon to the one seeking comfort, I, too, have become a mother. Through the idea which spontaneously produces its object. I believe that there is foundation enough at hand for a sleepless night, if those fantasies peculiar to the age of puberty were to become possessed of this idea. The results would be immeasurable. all this is psychologic. All that is psychologic has an under and over meaning, and as is expressed by the profound remark of the old mystic, Uranos anau, Uranos katau, aithira anau, aithira xatau, pan tuto anau, pan tuto katau, tuto labe, kai iutekai, utexai. Translation: the heathen above, the heathen, the heaven above, the heaven below, the sky above, the sky below, all things above, all things below, decline and rise. We would show but slight justice, however, to the intellectual originality of our author, if we were satisfied to trace back the commotion of that sleepless night absolutely and entirely to the sexual problem in a narrow sense. This would be but a half-truth, and truly, to make use of the mystic's expression, only the under half. The other half is the intellectual sublimation, which strives to make true in its own way the ambiguous expression of the idea which produces its object spontaneously, ideal creation in the place of mind. In such an intellectual accomplishment of an evidently very capable personality, the prospect of a spiritual fruitfulness is something which is worthy of the highest aspiration, since for many it will become the necessity of life. Also, this side of the fantasy explains to a great extent the excitement, for it is a thought with a presentiment of the future, one of those thoughts which arise, to use one of Maeterlinck's expressions, from the inconscient superior, that prospective potency of subliminal combinations. Footnote. This time I shall hardly be spared the reproach of mysticism, but perhaps effects should be further considered. Doubtless the unconscious contains material combinations with their historical determinants, for it is one of the essential tasks of analysis to render impotent by disillusion the content of complexes competing with proper conduct of life. Psychoanalysis works backwards like the science of history, just as the larger part of the past is so far removed that it is not reached by history, so too the greater part of the unconscious determinants is unreachable. However, history, knows nothing of these two kinds of things, that which is hidden in the past and that which is hidden in the future. But perhaps both perhaps might be attained with a certain probability, the first as a postulate, the second as a historical prognosis. Insofar as tomorrow is already contained in today, all the threads of the future are in place, so a more profound knowledge of the past might render possible a more or less far-reaching and certain knowledge of the future. Let us transfer this reasoning, as Kant has already done, to psychology. Then, necessarily, we must come to the same result. Just as traces of memory long since fallen below the threshold of consciousness are accessible to the unconscious, so too there are certain very fine subliminal combinations of the future, which are at the greatest significance for future happenings, in so far as the future is concerned, by our own psychology. But just so little as the science of history concerns itself with the combinations for the future, which is the function of the politics, so, alas, are the psychological combinations for the future the object of analysis. They would be much more the object of an infinitely refined psychoanalytical synthesis, which attempts to follow the natural current of the libido. This we cannot do, but possibly this might happen to the unconscious, and it appears as if from time to time, in certain cases, significant fragments of this process come to light, at least in dreams. From this comes the prophetic significance of the dream, long claimed by the superstitions. The aversion of the scientific man of today to this type of thinking, hardly to be called fantastic, is merely an overcompensation to the very ancient and all too great inclination of mankind to believe in prophecies and superstitions. End of footnote. I have had the opportunity of observing certain cases of neurosis of years' duration, in which, at the time of the beginning of the illness or shortly before, a dream occurred, often of visionary clarity. This impressed itself inextinguishably upon the memory, and in analysis revealed a hidden meaning to the patient, which anticipated the subsequent events of life, that is to say, the psychologic meaning. Footnote. Dreams seem to remain spontaneously in the memory just so long as they give a correct resume of the psychologic situation of the individual. I am inclined to grant this meaning to the commotion of that restless night, because the resulting effects of life, in so far as Miss Miller consciously and unconsciously unveils them to us, are entirely of a nature to confirm the supposition that the moment is to be considered as an inception and presentiment of a sublimated aim in life. Miss Miller concludes a list of her fancies with the following remarks. The dreams seem to me to come from a mixture of the representation of Paradise Lost, Job, and creation, with ideas such as thoughts which spontaneously produce its objects, the gift of love, chaos, and cosmos. In the same way as colored splinters of glass are combined in a kaleidoscope, in her mind fragments of philosophy, aesthetics, and religion would seem to be combined. Quote, under the stimulating influence of the journey, and the countries hurriedly seen, combined with the great silence and the indescribable charm of the sea, ce ne fut que cela et rien de plus. Only this and nothing more. Unquote. With these words, Miss Miller shows us out politely and energetically. Her parting words, in her negation, confirmed over again in English, leave behind a curiosity. What position is to be negated by these words? Ce ne fut que cela et rien de plus. That is to say, really only le charme impalpable de la mer, and the young man who sang melodiously during the night watch is long since forgotten, and no one is to know, least of all the dreamer, that he was a morning star, who came before the creation of a new day. Footnote. How paltry are the intrinsic ensemble and the detail of the erotic experience is shown by this frequently varied love song, which I quote in its epiriotic form. Epiriotic love song. O maiden, when we kissed, then it was night. Who saw us? A night star saw us, and the moon, and it leaned downward to the sea, gave it the tidings. Then the sea told the rudder told the sailor put it into song. Then the neighbor heard it, then the priest heard it, told my mother. From her the father heard it, he got a burning anger. They quarreled with me and commanded me, and they forbidden me ever to go to the door, ever to go to the window, and yet I will go to the door, as if to my flowers, and never will I rest till my beloved is mine. End of footnote. One should take care lest he satisfy himself and the reader with a sentence such as ce ne fut que cela. Otherwise, it might immediately happen that no one would seem to become what no one that otherwise it might immediately happen that one would become disturbed again. This occurs to Miss Miller too, since she allowed an English quotation to follow, only this and nothing more, without giving the source, it is true. The quotation comes from an unusually effective poem, The Raven, by Poe. The line referred to occurs in the following, quote, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of some gently rapping at my chamber's door. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber's door, only this and nothing more. The special raven knocks nightly at his door and reminds the poet of his irrevocably lost Lenore. The raven's name is Nevermore, and as a refrain to every verse he croaks his horrible Nevermore. Old memories come back tormentingly, and the spectre repeats inexorably, nevermore. The poet seeks in vain to frighten away the dismal gust. He calls to the raven. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest, and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak out from thy heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quote the raven, nevermore. The quotation, which apparently skips lightly over the situation, only this and nothing more, comes from a text which depicts in an affecting manner the despair over the lost Lenore. That quotation also misleads our poet in the most striking manner. Therefore she undervalues the erotic impression and the wide-reaching effort of the commotion caused by it. It is this undervaluation which Freud has formulated more precisely as repression, which is the reason why the erotic problem does not attain directly conscious treatment, and from this there arise these psychological riddles. The erotic impression works in the unconscious, and, in its stead, pushes symbols forth into consciousness. Thus one plays hide and seek with oneself. First it is the morning star which sing together, then paradise lost, then the erotic yearning clothes itself in an ecclesiastical dress and utters dark words about world creation, and finally rises into a religious hymn, to find there at last a way out into freedom, a way against which the censor of the moral personality can oppose nothing more. The hymn contains in its own peculiar character the marks of its origin. It thus has fulfilled itself, the law of the return of the complex. The night singer, in this circuitous manner of the old transference of the father priest, has become the eternal, the creator, the god of tone, of light, of love. The indirect course of the libido seems to be a way of sorrow, at least Paradise Lost, and the parallel reference to Job lead one to that conclusion. If we take, in addition to this, the introductory and intimation of the identification with Christian, then we see concludes with Cyrano, then we are furnished with material which pictures the indirect course of the libido as truly as a way of sorrow. It is the same as when mankind, after the sinful fall, has the burden of an earthly life to bear, or like the torments of Job, who suffered under the powers of Satan and of God, who himself, without suspecting it, became a plaything of the superhuman forces which we no longer consider as metaphysical, but as metapsychological. Faust also offers us some exhibition of God's wager. Mephistopheles, will you bet? There's still a chance to gain him, if unto me full leave you give, gently upon my road to train him. Satan, but put forth thine hand now, and touch all he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. Job 1:11. While in Job the two great tendencies are characterized simply as good and bad, the problem in Faust is pronouncedly erotic one, the battle between sublimation and eros, in which the devil is strikingly characterized through the fitting role of erotic temper. The erotic is lacking in Job. At the same time, Job is not conscious of the conflict with his own soul. He even continuously disputes the arguments of his friends who wish to convince him of the evil in his own heart. To this extent one might say that Faust is considerably more honorable, since he openly confesses the torments of his soul. Miss Miller acts like Job. She says nothing, and lets the evil and the good come from the other world, from the metapsychologic. Therefore the identification with Job is also significant in this respect. A wider, and indeed a very important analogy remains to be mentioned. The creative power, which love really is, rightly considered from the natural standpoint, remains as the real attribute of the divinity, sublimated from the erotic impression. Therefore, in the poem, God is praised throughout as creator. Job offers the same illustration. Satan is the destroyer of Job's fruitfulness. God is the fruitful one himself, and therefore, at the end of the book, he gives forth, as an expression of his own creative power, this hymn, filled with lofty poetic beauty. In this hymn, strangely enough, two unsympathetic representations of the animal kingdom, Behemoth and Labyrinthian, both expressive of the crudest force conceivable in nature, are given chief consideration. The behemoth being really the phallic attribute of the god of creation. Quote, behold now Behemoth, which I made as well as thee, he eateth grass as an ox. Lo, now his strength is in his loins, and his force in the muscles of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together, his bones are as tubes of brass. His limbs are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the way of God. He only made him giveth his sword. Behold, if a river overflow, he trembleth not. He is confident, though a Jordan swell even to his mouth. Shall any take him when he is on the watch, or pierce through his nose with a snare? Canst thou draw Levinthian with a fishhook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Lay thy hand upon him, remember the battle, and do no more. None is so fierce and dare stir him up. Who, who is he that can stand before me? Who hath first given unto me, that I should repay him? Whoever is under the whole heaven is mine. Job 40, 15 through 20, 23 through 24, and 41, 1, 8, and 10 through 11. God says this in order to bring his power and omnipotence impressively before Job's eyes. God is like the behemoth and the Levanthian, the fruitful nature giving forth abundance, the untamable wilderness and boundlessness of nature, the overwhelming danger of the unchained power. Footnote, Job 41:13 Levanthian. 21. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. 22. In his neck remaineth strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him. 24. His heart is as firm as a stone, yes, as hard as a piece of the nether millstone. 25. When he raiseth up himself, the mighty are afraid. By reason of breakings they purify themselves. 33. Upon earth there is not his like who is made without fear. 24. He beholdeth all high things. He is a king over all the children of pride. Chapter 42. 1. Then Job answered the Lord and said, 2. I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. End of footnote. But what has destroyed Job's earthly paradise? The unchained power of nature, as the poet lets it be seen here. God has simply turned his other side outwards for once, the side which man calls the devil, and which lets loose all the torments of nature on Job, naturally for the purpose of discipline and training. The God who created such monstrosities, before whom the poor weak man stiffens with anxiety, truly must hide qualities within himself, which are food for thought. God lives in the heart, in the unconscious, in the realm of metapsychology. There is the source of the anxiety before the unspeakably horrible, and the strength to withhold the horrors. The person, that is to say, their conscious I, is like a plaything, like a feather which is whirled around by different currents of air, and sometimes the sacrifice and sometimes the sacrificer, and they cannot hinder either. The book of Job shows us God at work both as creator and destroyer. Who is this God? A thought which humanity in every part of the world and in all ages has brought forth from itself, and always again anew in similar forms. A power in the other world in which people give praise, a power which creates as well as destroys, an idea necessary to life. Since psychologically understood, the divinity is nothing else than a projected complex of representations which is accentuated in feeling according to the degree of religiousness of the individual. So God is to be considered as a representative of a certain sum of energy, libido. This energy, therefore, appears projected metaphysically because it works from the unconscious outwards. When it is dislodged from there, as psychoanalysis shows, as I have earlier made apparent in the Betung des Vaters, the religious instinct feeds upon the incestuous libido of the infantile period. In the principal forms of religion which now exist, the father transference seems to be at least the molding influence. In older religions it seems to be the influence of the mother transference, which creates the attributes of the divinity. The attributes of the divinity are omnipotence, a sternly persecuting paternalism ruling through fear in the Old Testament, and a loving paternalism in the New Testament. There are attributes of the libido in that wild sense in which Freud has conceived this idea empirically. Certain pagan and also in Christian attributes of divinity, the maternal stands out strongly, and in the former the animal also comes into great prominence. Footnote. The theory-morphic attributes are lacking in the Christian religion except as remnants such as the dove, the fish, and the lamb. The latter is also represented as a ram, the dove, the fish, and the lamb. The latter is also represented as a ram in the drawings in the catacombs. Here belong the animals associated with the evangelists, which particularly need historical explanation. The eagle and the lion were definite degrees of initiation in the Mithric mysteries. The worshippers of Dionysus called themselves bois, because the god was represented as a bull. Likewise, Arachthoi of Artemis, conceived as a she-bear. The angel might correspond to Helidromoi of the Mithras mysteries. It is indeed an exquisite invention of the Christian fantasy that the animal coupled with St. Anthony is a pig, for the good saint was one of those who were subjected to the devil's most evil temptations. Likewise, the infantile, so closely interwoven with religious fantasies, and from time to time breaking forth so violently, is nowhere lacking. All this points to the source of the dynamic stages of religious activity. There are those impulses which in childhood are withdrawn from incestuous application through the intervention of the incest barrier, and which, especially in the time of puberty, as a result of affixes of the libido, coming from the still incompletely employed sexuality, are aroused in their own peculiar activity. As is easily understood, that which is valuable in the God-creating idea is not in the form, but the power, the libido. The primitive power which Job's hymn of creation vindicates, the unconditional and the unjust and the superhuman are truly and rightly attributes of libido, which lead us unto life, which let the poor be guilty, quote unquote, and against which struggle is in vain. Nothing remains for mankind but to work in harmony with this will. Nietzsche's Zarathustra teaches us this impressively. We see that in Miss Miller the religious hymn arising from the unconscious is the compensating amend for the erotic. It takes a part of its material from the infantile reminiscences which she reawakened into life by the introversion of the libido. Had this religious creation not succeeded, and had another subliminal application been eliminated, then Miss Miller would have yielded to the erotic impression, either to its natural consequences or to a negative issue, which would have replaced the lost success in love by a corresponding strong sorrow. It is well known that opinions are much divided concerning the worth of this issue of an erotic conflict, such as Miss Miller has presented to us. It is thought to be much more beautiful and to solve unnoticed and erotic tension in the elevated feeling of religious poetry, in which perhaps many other people can find joy and consolation. One is wrong to storm against this conception from the radical standpoint of fanaticism for truth. I think that one should view the philosophic admiration, the strained paths of the libido, and should investigate the purposes of its circuitous ways. It is not too much to say that we have herewith dug up the erotic root, and yet the problem remains unsolved. Were there not bound up with that a mysterious purpose, probably of the greatest biological meaning, then certainly 20 centuries would not have yearned for it with such intense longing. Doubtless this sort of libidian current moves in the same direction as, taken in the widest sense, did the ecstatic ideal of the Middle Ages and of the ancient mystery cults, one of which became the later Christianity. There is to be seen biologically in this ideal an exercise of psychologic projection of the paranoidean mechanism as Freud would express it. Footnote. The Book of Job, originating at a later period than non-Jewish influences, is a striking presentation of individual projection psychology. Footnote. The projection consists in the repressing of the conflict into the unconscious and the setting forth of the repressed contents into seeming objectivity, which is also the formula of paranoia. The repression serves, as is well known, for the feeling from a painful complex from which one must escape by all means, because its compelling and oppressing power is feared. The repression can lead to an apparent complete suppression, which corresponds to a strong self-control. Unfortunately, however, self-control has limits which are only too narrowly drawn. Closer observation of people shows, it is true, that calm is maintained at a critical moment, but certain results occur which fall into two categories. First, the suppressed effort comes to the surface immediately afterwards, seldom directly, it is true, but ordinarily in the form of a displacement to another object, like a person is, in official relations, polite, submissive, patient, and so on, and turns their whole anger loose upon their spouse or their subordinates. Second, the suppressed effort creates compensations elsewhere. For example, people who strive for excessive ethics, who try always to think, feel, and act altruistically and ideally, avenge themselves because of the impossibility of carrying their ideals by subtle maliciousness, which naturally does not come into their own consciousness as such, but which leads to misunderstandings and unhappy situations. Apparently, then, all of these are only especially unfortunate circumstances, quote unquote, or they are the guilt and malice of other people, or they are tragic complications, apparently. One is, indeed, freed of the conscious conflict, nevertheless, it lies invisible at one's feet and is stumbled over at every step. The technique of the apparent suppressing and forgetting is inadequate because it is not possible of achievement in the last analysis. It is, in reality, a mere makeshift. The religious projection offers a much more effectual help. In this one keeps the conflict in sight, care, pain, anxiety, and so forth, and gives it over to a personality standing outside of oneself, the divinity. The evangelical command teaches us this: cast all your anxiety upon him, because he careth for you. 1 Peter 5:7. In nothing be anxious, but in everything by prayer and supplication let your request be made known unto God. Phil 4:6. One must give the burdening complex of the soul consciously over to the deity, that is to say, associate it with a definite representative complex which is set up as objectively real, as a person who answers these questions, for us unanswerable. To this inner demand belongs the candid avowal of sin and the Christian humility presuming such an avowal. Both are for the purpose of making it possible for one to examine oneself and to know oneself. Footnote. Quote, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. 1 John 1:8. End of footnote. One may consider the mutual avowal of sins as the most powerful support to this work of education. Quote, Confess therefore your sins one to another. James 5:16. These measures aim at a conscious recognition of the conflicts, thoroughly psychoanalytic, which is also a conditio sine qua non of the psychoanalytic condition of recovery. Just as psychoanalysis in the hands of a physician, a secular method set up as the real object of transference, as the one to take over the conflicts of the oppressed and to solve them, so the Christian religion sets up as the Savior, considered it as real, quote, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of his sins. Footnote. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrow. Isaiah 8:4. He, or 7:4. He is the deliverer and redeemer of our guilt, a God who stands above sin, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. Peter 2:22. Who his own self bare our sins in his body upon the tree. Peter 2:24. Therefore Christ has been sacrificed once to take away the sins of many. Hebrew 9:28. Thus the God thus thought of, is distinguished as innocent in himself and as a self-sacrificer. These qualities are true also for that amount of energy, libido, which belongs in the representation complex designated the Redeemer. The conscious projection towards which the Christian education aims offers, therefore, a double benefit. First, one is kept conscious of the conflict, sins, of two opposing tendencies mutually resistant, and through this one prevents a known trouble from becoming, by means of repressing and forgetting, an unknown and therefore so much more tormenting sorrow. Second, one lightens one's burden by surrendering it to him to whom all solutions are known. One must not forget that the individual psychologic roots of the deity, set up as real by the pious, are concealed from him, and that he, although unaware of this, still bears the burden alone, and is still alone with his conflict. This delusion would lead infallibly to the speedy breaking up of the system, for nature cannot indefinitely be deceived, but the powerful institution of Christianity meets the situation. The command in the book of James is the best expression of the psychologic significance of, quote, bear ye one another's burdens. Footnote. Bear ye one another's burdens. Galatians 6:2. And footnote. This is emphasized as especially important in order to preserve society upright through mutual love, transference. The Pauline writings leave no doubt about this. Quotes now. Through love be servants to one another. Galatians 5:13. Let love of the brethren continue. Hebrew 13:1. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and good works, not forgetting our own assembling together, as is the custom of some, but exhorting one another. Hebrew 10:24-25. We might say that the real transference taught in the Christian community is the condition absolutely necessary for the efficacy of the miracle of redemption. The first letter of John comes out frankly with this: He that loveth his brother abide in the light. 1 John 2:10. For we love one another, God abideth in us. 1 John 6:12. The deity continues to be efficacious in the Christian religion only upon the foundations of brotherly love. Consequently, here too the mystery of redemption is the unresisting real transference. Footnote. God is love, corresponding to the Platonic eros, which unites humanity with the transcendental. One may properly ask oneself, for what, then, is the deity useful, if his efficacy consists only in real transference? To this also the evangelical message has a striking answer. Quotes, Men are all brothers in Christ. So Christ also, having been offered to bear the sins of many, shall appear a second time apart from sin to them, and then wait for him unto salvation. Hebrew 9:28. The condition of transference among brothers is to be such as between man and Christ, a spiritual one. As the history of ancient cults and certain Christian sects shows, this explanation of the Christian religion is an especially important one biologically, for the psychologic intimacy creates certain shortened ways between men, which lead only too easily to that from which Christianity seeks to release them, namely to the sexual relation with all those consequences and necessities under which the really already highly civilized person had to suffer at the beginning of our Christian era. For just as the ancient religious experience was regarded distinctly as a bodily union with a deity, just so was worship permeated with sexuality of every kind. Footnote. Compare Reitzenstein, quote, among the various forms with which a primitive people have represented the highest religious consecration, union with God belongs necessarily that of the sexual union, in which the man attributes to his semen the innermost nature and power of God. That which was in the first instance wholly a sensual act becomes in the most widely separated places independently a sacred act in which the god is represented by a human deputy or his symbol in the phallus. Under footnote. The moral degeneracy of the first Christian century produced a moral reaction arising out of the darkness of the low strata of society, which was expressed in the second and third centuries as its purest in the two antagonistic religions, Christianity on the one side and Mithraism on the other. These religions strove after precisely the higher form of social intercourse symbolic of the projected become flesh idea, logos, whereby all those strongest impulsive energies of the archaic person formally plunged them from one passion into another. Footnote. Take as an example, among many others, the striking psychologic description of the fate of Alypius in the Confessions of St. Augustine. Quote, only the moral iniquity of Carthage, expressed in the absolute wilderness of its worthless spectacles, had drawn him down into the whirlpool of this misery. Augustine at the time was a teacher of logic, though his wisdom had converted Alypius. He rose up after these words from the depths of the mire into which he had willingly let himself be submerged, and which had blinded him with fatal pleasure. He stripped the filth off his soul with courageous abstemiousness. All the snares of Hippodrome no longer perplexed him. Thereupon Alypius went to Rome in order to study law, and there he became a backslider. He was transported to an unbelievable degree. He was transported to an unbelievable degree by an unfortunate passion for gladiator shows. Although in the beginning he abdominated and cursed these shows, one evening some of his friends and fellow students, whom he met after they had dined, in spite of his passionate refusals and exertions of all the power of his resistance, dragged him with friendly violence to the amphitheatre on the occasion of a cruel and murderous exhibit. At the time he said, if you drag my body to that place and hold it there, can you turn my mind and my eyes to the spectacle? In spite of his supplications, they dragged him with and were eager to know if he would be able to resist the spectacle. When they arrived, they sat down where places were still left, and all glowed with inhuman delight. He closed his eyes and forbade his soul to expose itself to such danger. Oh, if he had stopped up to his ears! Then someone fell in combat, and all the people set up a mighty shout, and he stifled his curiosity and prepared proudly to scorn the sight, confident that he would view the spectacle, if he so desired. And his soul was overcome with terrible wounds like the wounds of the body, which he desired to see, and souls more miserable than the one whose fall had caused the outcry, which pressed through his ears, had opened his eyes, so that his weakness had been bared. His weakness had been bared. Through this he could be struck and thrown down, for he had the feeling of confidence more than strength, and he was the weaker because he trusted himself to this and not to thee. When he saw the blood, then at the same time he drew in the desire for blood, and no longer turned away, but directed his look thither. The fury took possession of him, and yet he did not know it. He took delight in the wicked combat, and was intoxicated by the bloody pleasure. And now he was no longer the same as when he had come, and he was the true accomplice of those who had first dragged him there. What more is there to say? He saw, he cried out, he was inflamed, and he carried away with him the insane longing which enticed him again and again, not only in the company of those who first dragged him with them, but was going ahead of all and leading others. End of footnote. 29. So, where we were was that these religions, we'll start over the sentence. These religions strove after precisely that higher form of social intercourse, symbolic of a projected becoming flesh idea, logos, whereby all those stronger impulsive energies are the archaic person, formally plunging them from one passion into another, and which seem to the ancients like the compulsion of the evil constellations, as I ma ramine maramne, and which, in the sense of the later ages, might be translated by the driving force of the libido, the dunamis. And let's look at the two footnotes for this. So, I ma ramne is destiny, and with regarding to the driving force of the libido, the footnote, compare the prayer of the so-called Mithric liturgy, published by Dietrich. Therefore, characteristic places are to be found, such as, for instance, tein anthrapinos mu tsugines dunameos in egao palin metaprara li Euphomia, metatin, Eistenstaustan, kai, capti, paigusan, me, paixran, anagaxnen, axristo, ko, piniton, which is the human soul forces which I, weighed down by guilt, would again attain, because of the present bitter need oppressing me. And epixalumai en ixan tis cate paigustos kai paixapos aparaitintu anagkisnis, on account of the oppressing, bitter, and inexorable need. From the speech of the high priest, Appius Metamorphosis, a similar train of thought may be gathered. The young philosopher Lucius was changed into an ass, that continuously rutting animal which Isis hated. Later he was released from the enchantment and initiated into the mysteries of Isis. When he was freed from the spell, the priest spoke as follows. Lubucrio verentius, aetate ad servilis de lapsus voluptes tatis, curiosities improspere sinistrum premium reportiam nam in eos coram sibi vitus servitum Dei nostra magistros vindicatis, non habit locum casus infestus, in tantillam jam res subtus es fortunae sed videntes, translated, but falling into the slavery of pleasure, into the wantonness of books and youth, you have reaped the inauspicious reward of your ill-fated curiosity. For direful calamity has no power over those whose lives the majesty of our goddess has claimed for her own service. You are now received under the guardianship of fortune, but of a fortune you can see. In the prayer to the Queen of Heavens, Isis, Lucius says, Quo valorem etiam inextriabilatir contorta retrastas Lycia et fortunae temptastes mitigas, et stellarum noxios mitius gohibis, translated, by which thou dost unravel the inextricably entangled threads of the fates, and dost assuage the tempests of fortune, and restrain the malignant influences of the stars. Generally, it was the purpose of the rite to destroy the evil compulsion of the star, quote-unquote, by magical power. The power of fate makes itself felt unpleasantly only when everything goes against our will, that is to say, when we no longer find ourselves in harmony with ourselves. As I endeavor to show in my article, by die Bentuwig de Vaters, etc., the most dangerous power of fate lies in the infantile libido fixation, localized in the unconscious. The power of fate reveals itself at a closer range as a compulsion of libido. Wherefore, Master Link justly says that a Socrates could not possibly be a tragic hero of the type of Hamlet. In accordance with this conception, the ancients had already placed Aimaren destiny in relation to a primal light or primal fire. In the Stoic conception of the primal cause, the warmth spread everywhere, which has created everything, and which is therefore destiny. Compare Commot. This warmth is, as will later be shown, a symbol of the libido. Another conception of the anarche, or necessity, is, according to the book of Zoroaster, peri fusius, concerning nature, that the air as wind had once a connection with fertility. I am indebted to Reverend Dr. Keller of Zurich for calling my attention to Bergstrom's conception of the Dire Creatis. So, then we were at a footnote, and we were talking about the ancients, like the compulsion of the evil constellations, as I marmen me, which is destiny, and which, in the sense of later ages, might be translated as the driving force of the libido, the du neis, kai ni tixe of Zeno, which is power for putting in motion, could be made use of for social preservation. Footnote. Schiller says in Wallerstein, in your breast let the constellation of your fate. Our fates are the results of our personality, as Emerson says in his essays. Compare this with my remarks in Die Bund, that other essay he wrote. It may be assured, end of footnote, it may be assured most certainly that the domestication of humanity has cost the greatest sacrifice. An age which produced the Stoical ideal must certainly have known why and against what it was created. The age of Nero serves as to set off as effectively the famous extracts from the 41st letter of Seneca to Lucilius. Quote, "One drags the other into error, and how can we attain to salvation when no one binds us halt, when all the world drives us in deeper? Do you ever come across a person unafraid in danger, untouched by desires, happy in misfortune, peaceful in the midst of a storm, elevated above ordinary mortals, on the same place as gods? Does not reverence seize you? Are you not compelled to say, such an exalted being is certainly something different from the miserable body which they inhabit? A divine strength rules here such an excellent mind, full in moderation, raised above all trivialities, which smiles at that which we others fear or strive after. A heavenly power animates such a person. A thing of this kind does not exist without the cooperation of a deity. The largest part of such a being belongs to a region from which they came, just as the sun's rays touch the earth in reality, and yet are at home only there from whence they come. So an eminent holy person associates with us. They are sent to us that we may know the divine better, and although with us, still really belong to their original home. They look thither and reach toward it. Amongst us they walk as an exalted being." End quote. Note from reader. The he's are turned to they, so as to not be sexist. End of quotes. The rest of the text. The people of this age had grown ripe for identification with the Logos word, become flesh, for the founding of a new fellowship united by one idea, in the name of which people could love each other and call each other brothers. Footnotes. The ascent of the idea is described with usual beauty in Augustine. The beginning of chapter 8 reads, quote, "I will raise myself over the force of my nature, step by step, ascending to him who has made me. I will come to the fields and the spacious places of my memory." Footnote. The followers of Mithra also called themselves brothers. In philosophical speech, Mithra was Logos, emanating from God. Besides the followers of Mithra, there existed many brotherhoods, which were called Thraci, and probably were the organization from which the church developed later. End of footnotes. The old vague idea of a Messiah, of a mediator in whose name new ways of love would be created, became a fact, and with that humanity made an immense step forward. This had not been brought about by a speculative, completely sophisticated philosophy, but by an elementary need in the mass of people vegetating in spiritual darkness. The profoundest necessities had evidently driven towards them that, since humanity did not thrive in the state of dissoluteness. Footnote. Augustine, who stood in close relation to that period of transition, not only in point of time but also intellectually, writes in his Confessions, quote, "Nor did I, unhappy, consider from which source it sprang, that even on those things, foul as they were, I with pleasure discoursed with my carnal pleasures. And yet these friends I loved for themselves only, and friends, nor could I, even according to the notions I had then of happiness, be happy without friends, amid which, with what abundance soever I felt, that I was beloved of them for myself only. O crooked paths! Woe to the audacious soul which hoped, by forsaking thee, to gain some better thing. Turned it hath, turned again, upon back, sides, and belly, yet all was painful, and thou alone rest." It is not only an unpsychologic but also an unscientific method of procedure to characterize offhand such effects of religion as Such things are to be taken seriously as the expression of the deepest psychological need. End of footnote. The meaning of these cults, I speak of Christianity and mythicism, is clear. It is a moral restraint of animal impulses. Footnote. Both religions teach a pronounced aesthetic morality, but at the same time a morality of action. The later is also true of mythicism. Footnote said that the mythicists owed its succession to the value of its moral, quote, thus this stimulated to action in an extraordinary degree, unquote. The followers of Mithra formed a sacred legion for battles against evil, and among them were virgins, nuns, and continence ascetics. Whether these brotherhoods had another meaning, that is, an economic communistic one, is something I will not discuss now. Here only the religious psychologic aspects interest us. Both religions have in common the idea of the divine sacrifice. Just as Christ sacrificed himself as the Lamb of the God, so did Mithra sacrifice his bull. This sacrifice in both religions is the heart of the mysteries. The sacrificial death of Christ means the salvation of the world. From the sacrifice of the bull of Mithra, the entire creation springs. End of footnote. The dynamic appearance of both religions betrays something of the enormous feeling of redemption which animated the first disciples, and which we today scarcely know how to appreciate, for those old truths are empty to us now. Most certainly we should still understand it, had our customs even a breadth of ancient brutality, but we can hardly realize in this day the whirlwinds of unchained libido which roared through the ancient Roman of Caesars. The civilized person of the present day seems very far removed from that. They have become merely neurotic. For us, the necessities which brought forth Christianity have actually been lost, since we no longer understand their meaning. We do not know against that which it has protected us. Footnote. The analytic perception of the roots of the mysteries religions is not necessarily one-sided, just as is the analysis of the basis of the religious poem. In order to understand the actual causes of the repression of Ms. Miller, one must delve into the moral history of the present. Just as one is obliged to seek in the ancient moral and economic history the ancient actual causes of repression which had given rise to the mystery cults. This investigation has been brilliantly carried out by Karltoff in his book Die Einschung des Christentums. I also refer especially to Povman's, I won't say that. The other cause of the enormous introversion of the libido in antiquity is probably to be found in the fact that an unbelievably large part of the people suffered in the wretched state of slavery. It is inevitably that finally those who bask in good fortune should be infected in the mysterious manner of the unconscious by the deep sorrow and still deeper misery of their brothers, through which some were driven into orgiastic furies. Others, however, the better ones, sank into that strange world-weariness and society of the intellectuals of that time. Thus, from two sources, the great introversion was made possible. End of footnote. For enlightened people, the so-called religiousness has already approached very close to neurosis. In the past 2,000 years, Christianity has done its work and has erected barriers of repression which protect us from the sight of our own sinfulness, quote-unquote sinfulness. The elementary emotions of the libido have come to be unknown to us, for they are carried on in the unconscious. Therefore, the belief which combats them has become hollow and empty. Let whoever does not believe that a mask covers our religion obtain an impression for themselves from the appearance of our modern churches, from which style and art have long since fled. With this, we turn back to the question from which we digressed, namely, whether or not Miss Miller has created something valuable with her poem. If we bear in mind under the psychological moral conditions Christianity came into existence, that is to say, at a time when fierce brutality was an everyday spectacle, then we understand the religious seizure of the whole personality and the worth of that religion which defended the people of the Roman culture against the visible storm of wickedness. It was not difficult for those people to remain conscious of sin, for they saw it every day spread out before their eyes. The religious product was, at that time, the accomplishment of the total personality. Ms. Miller not only undervalues her sins, but the connection between the depressing and unrelenting need and her religious product has even escaped her. Thus, her poetical creation completely loses the living value of a religious product. It is not much more than a sentimental transformation of the erotic, which is secretly carried out close to consciousness and principally possessed. This is the same worth as the manifest constraint of the dream, with its uncertain and delusive perishableness. Thus the poem is probably only a dream become audible. To the degree that the modern consciousness is eagerly busied with things of a wholly other sort than religion, religion and its object, original sin, have stepped into the background, that is to say, into the unconscious in great part. Therefore, today, people believe neither in one nor in the other. Consequently, the Freudian school is accused of an impure fantasy, and yet one might convince oneself of oneself very easily that with a rather fleeting glance at the history of ancient religions and morals as to what kinds of demons are harbored in the human soul. With this disbelief in the crudeness of human nature is bound up the disbelief in the power of the religion. The phenomenon, well known to every psychoanalyst, of the unconscious transformation of an erotic conflict into a religious activity is something ethically wholly worthless and nothing but a hysterical production. Whoever, on the other hand, to their conscious sin just as consciously places religion in opposition, does something in the greatness of which cannot be denied. This can be verified by a backward glance over history. Such a procedure is sound religion. The unconscious recasting of the erotic into something religious lays itself open to the reproach of sentimental and ethically worthless pose. By means of the secular practice of the naive projection, which is, as we have seen, nothing else than a veiled or indirect real transference through the spiritual, through the logos, Christian training has produced a widespread weakening of the animal nature, so that a great part of the strength of the impulses could be set free for the work of social preservation and fruitfulness. Footnote. Compare Freud's sublimation and 3 contributions to the sexual theory. End footnote. This abundance of libido, to make use of this singular expression, pursues with a budding renaissance, for example, Patriarch, a course which ongoing antiquity has already sketched out as religion, the way of transference to nature. Footnote. In a matter which is closely related to my thought, Karloff understands the secularizing of the religious interest as a new incarnation of Logos word. He said, quote, the profound grasp of the soul of nature evidenced in modern painting and poetry, the living intuitive feeling which even science in its most austere work can no longer do without, enables us easily to understand how the Logos of Greek philosophy, which assigned its place in the word of the old Christ type, clothed in its world-to-come significance, celebrated a new incarnation. End quote. End of footnote. The transformation of this libidinous interest is in great part due to the mythic worship, which was a nature religion in the best sense of the word. Footnote. It seems on account of the isolation of the cult that this fact was the cause of its ruin as well, because the eyes of that time were blinded to the beauty of nature. Augustine very justly remarks, quote, but they were themselves undone through love for her creation. End of footnote. While the primitive Christians exhibited throughout an agnostic attribute to the beauties of the world. Footnote, Augustine, quote, but what do I love when I love thee, God, O God? Not the bodily form, nor the earthly sweetness, nor the splendor of the light so dear to these eyes, nor the sweet melodies of the richly varied songs, not the flowers and the sweet-scented ointments and the spices of lovely fragrance, not manna and honey, not the limbs of the body whose embraces are pleasant to the flesh. I do not love thee when I love my God, and yet the light, the voice, the fragrance, the food, the embrace of my inner man, and even these shine unto my soul, which no space contains, which no time taketh away, where takes away, where there is a fragrance which does the wind not blow away, where there is a taste which no gluttony diminishes, and where harmony abides, which no satiety can remove. That is what I love when I love my God. Unquote. Perhaps a model for Zarathustra. End of footnote. I remember the passage of St. Augustine mentioned by J. Burckhardt. Quote, men draw thither to admiration the heights of the mountains, the powerful waves of the sea, and turn away from themselves. End quote. The foremost authority of the Mithric cult, Franz Kumult, says as follows, quote, the gods were everywhere and mingled in all the events of daily life. The fire which cooked the means of nourishment for the believers, and which warmed them, the water which quenched their thirst and cleansed them, and also the air which they breathed, and the day which shone for them, were the objects of their homage. Perhaps no religion has given to its adherents in so large a degree of Mithricism opportunity for prayer and motive for devotion. When the initiated betook themselves in the evening to the sacred grotto concealed in the solitude of the forest, at every step new sensations awakened in their heart, some mystical emotion. The stars that shone in the sky, the wind that whispered in the foliage, the spring, a brook which hastened murmuring to the valley, and even the earth which they trod under their feet, were in their eyes divine, and all surrounding nature a worshipful fear of the infinite forces that swayed the universe. Unquote. These fundamental thoughts of Mithricism, which, like so much else of the ancient spiritual life, arose again from their grave during the Renaissance, are to be found in the beautiful words of Seneca. Footnote. And this is footnote. This is from the 41st letter to Lucius. So, end of footnote. Quote, when you enter a grove peopled with ancient trees, higher than the ordinary, and whose boughs are so closely interwoven that the sky cannot be seen, the stately shadows of the wood, the privacy of the place, the awful gloom cannot but strike you, as with the presence of a deity, or that which we see some caves at the foot of a mountain penetrating the rocks, not made by human hands, but hollowed out to a great depth by nature. It fills the mind with a religious fear. We venerate the fountain-heads of the great rivers. The sudden eruption of a vast body of water from the secret places of the earth obtains an altar. We adore likewise the springs of warm baths, and either the opaque quality or immense depths have made some lakes sacred. Unquote. All this disappeared in the transitory world of the Christian, only to break forth much later, when the thought of mankind had achieved the independence of the idea, which could resist the aesthetic impression, so that thought was no longer fettered by the emotional effects of the impression, but could arise to reflective observation. Thus people entered into a new and independent relation to nature, whereby the foundation was laid for natural science and technique. With that, however, there entered in for the first time a displacement of the weight of interest. There arose again in real transference, which had reached its greatest development in our time. Materialistic interest has everywhere become paramount. Therefore, the realms of the spirit, were earlier the greatest conflicts and developments took place, lie deserted and fallow. The world has not only lost its God, as the sentimentalists of the 19th century bewail, but also to some extent lost its soul as well. One, therefore, cannot wonder that the discoveries and doctrines of the Freudian school, with their wholly psychologic views, met with an almost universal disapproval. Through the challenge of the center of interest from the inner to the outer world, the knowledge of nature has increased enormously in comparison with the earlier times. By this anthropomorphic connection of the religious dogmas has been definitely thrown open the question. Therefore, the present-day religion can only with the greatest difficulty close their eyes to this fact, for not only has the intense interest been diverted from the Christian religion, but criticism and necessary correction have increased correspondingly. The Christian religion seems to have filled its great biological purpose, insofar as we were able to judge. It has led human thought to independence and has lost its significance, therefore, to a yet undetermined extent. In any case, its dogmatic contents have become related to Mithricism. In consideration of the fact that this religion has rendered nevertheless inconceivable service to education, one cannot reject it eo ipso today. It seems to me that we might still make use of it in some way, of its form of thought, and especially of its great wisdom of life, for which 2,000 years has been proven to be particularly efficacious. The stumbling block is the unhappy combination of religion and morality. That must be overcome. There still remains traces of the strife in the soul, the lack of which in a human being is reluctantly felt. It is hard to say in what such things consist. For this, ideas as well as words are lacking. If in spite of that I attempt to say something about it, I do, parabolically, using Seneca's words. Quote, "Nothing can be more commendable and beneficial if you persevere in the pursuit of wisdom. It is that which would be ridiculous to wish for when it is in your power to attain it. There is no need to lift up your hands to heaven or to pray the servant of the temple to admit you to the ear of the idol that your prayers may be heard the better. God is near thee. He is with thee. Yet, Lucilius, the Holy Spirit resides within us, the observer of good and evil, our constant guardian. And as we treat him, he treats us. No good man is without God. Could anyone ever rise above the power of fortune without his assistance? It is he that inspires us with thoughts upright, just, and pure. We do not indeed pretend to say, what God, but that a God dwells in the breast of every good man is certain." Reader's commentary. This is chapter 3 of The Psychology of the Unconscious, and this book was originally published in 1916. So my commentary is with that in mind, and that Jung definitely did himself grow and come into his own consciousness and realization of his unconscious over the course of his work. However, I would say that what startles me about this is that Jung finds that works of art are worthless if they're not conscious of the unconscious, which is an oxymoron in itself, and which he said many times, that one must be conscious that there is an unconscious and that there are these forces at work within us. To be able to produce great works of art, I think, is also folly. And I wonder if Jung said this about Miss Miller's work because she was a woman. There's a noted sexism in his work, and also in historically in those he refers to. It makes me sad that that's there, because Jung was very much supported by women. Many of his students were women, many of his followers were women, and he seemed to, in his acts, actually esteem women. It's also very sad to me because when we look back at history, so much of history is by men, and if we had esteemed women, what would our history be like, and how could we have perhaps evaded or circumvented some of the tragedies that we see today, and that we will probably continue to see until we get to a point where we as a culture are whole. And so you'll see a lot in my reading that I say they or them or she instead of he, to try to help compensate for that. So to finish the piece on the work of Miss Miller, I'll just finish this part of the commentary by re-quoting her poem, and you can judge for yourself whether or not it would have been worthy of esteem as many of the male poets were esteemed at her time. When the Eternal first made sound, a myriad ears sprang out to hear, and throughout all the universe there rolled an echo deep and clear, all glory to the God of sound. When the Eternal first made light, a myriad eyes sprang out to look, and hearing ears and seeing eyes, once more a mighty choral took, all glory to the God of light. When the Eternal first gave love, a myriad hearts sprang into life. Ears filled with music, eyes with light, pealed forth with hearts and love all rife. All glory to the God of love. So my other commentary on this chapter is about the death of religion and Jung's concern that while Christianity had done a great deal, and I would say probably Judaism too, and Muslim religion at that time, 2,000 years ago, have done a great deal to foster growth in humanity and ending of a really truly brutal existence, that it was interesting that Jung couldn't see what religion or religiousness is taking its place, and that he's actually one of those who was instrumental, I think, in creating this new religion, which we call science. And we can see as evidence, I think, one of the ways, or two of the ways in which science has become the new religion. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it would be good if we were a little more observant of it. But there's two ways that it's become religion, and that we see lots of trends where people are finding in space or in explanations of the creation of the universe or multiverse or whatever you want to call it, people are really seeing access to God, access to, I heard one person say it in a very, very sloppy way, which was clear to me that it was a religion. The universe, the uni is the you it means you, which is, of course, a very religious and I think somewhat irrational way of understanding science. And the other way that we can see that science has become our religion, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, just would be good if we were aware of it, is where we see whole groups of people contesting things like climate change. Well, it's clear that societally science is not based on fact, it's based on belief. And it would be really nice if we could see that, and so perhaps bring that unconscious part of ours wanting to help bring about order from chaos, or love as our predominating force instead of conquering and hierarchy and chaos. We could see that and work with it in a way that we now see how religion, in terms of Christianity, Judaism, Muslim, is, as Jung said, archaic and no longer functioning. So that's my commentary on this chapter. Thank you if you listened this far.